Hello, friends and family of the world of paleoanthropology. Today is another episode of the Story of Us, which I know we don't get too many of these days. Times are hard and there's so much work going on, but I have a very, very special guest with us today. And, if you want to keep seeing these special guests come on the show and you want to help the podcast be produced and just even keep the website running, a like and a subscribe to the channel really goes a massive way. So, our special guest is here, and I will hand it over to her for her to introduce herself. And I am just so excited. So, here we go.
Hi, everybody. I'm Leslea Hlusko, and I'm an investigator at the Spanish National Research Center on Human Evolution. So I'm in Burgos in Spain, which is
Which
very famous because it's so close to Atapuerca, the Sierra de
exactly,
Atapuerca.
exactly, which I'm sure many of my listeners know about that site, but maybe during this episode we'll touch on that a little bit because it is just such a astonishing locality.
Yeah, whenever
Just
people are like, "Oh, how do you like Spain? How do you like living in that part of Spain?" I'm like, "Well, it's an amazing place because people have been here for over 1 million years." So,
exactly. It must something. It's like when you go to a restaurant and it's packed. You're like, oh, something. It must be good here. Yeah, people have been there for a long time. So I wanted to invite you on the show for a few reasons. One of those is being the massive contributions that you've made to the field and the work that you've done. The
thanks.
fact, the work that you're doing now, um, which I want to hear about. I'm sure my guests want to hear about. And of course, also, you happen to be the current president of the AABA, which, for those who don't know, is the American Association of Biological Anthropologists. And that's pretty big. They hold an annual meeting every year and tons of other activities throughout the year. We'll talk about that during the show because I am attending and I know I want to see a lot of you guys there. We have some fun, exciting plans. I know I've already been invited to be a speaker on a panel. So if you guys want to see
Wonderful.
that,
Yeah,
uh,
that's great.
be sure to attend. But yeah, so let's start. How did you get where you are? You're in Spain right now. I know that is somewhat recent, I believe.
Yeah, it is. I moved here in May of 2021. So, was it 2021? Yes, 2021. When did the pandemic start? Yeah.
2020. Yeah, 20,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
believe
So I was
March
offered the
2020.
job in like August of 2020, but I wasn't able to come for a little bit more time because there was no travel and I had to finish teaching because I was, prior to this, must have been about 17, 18 years, I was a professor at the University of California, Berkeley in the
Wow.
Department of
Yeah.
Integrative Biology. Yeah, so I am one of these strange people who left a tenured professorship at a Research One university for something new. But it was a time for a change, and this
Yeah.
has been a fantastic one. Yeah, so the NIE, so it's the um, Centro Nacional de Investigación sobre la Evolución Humana. So that's the Spanish name for it. So it's a research center focused on human evolution that was started back, I think it began as an idea back in the 1990s. The building that we're currently in is, I think, close to 15 years old. So
Mm.
it's not very old. We study really, really old things, but the center itself is just this amazing brainchild and result of the force of will of just the amazing scientists that work in human evolution here in Spain. So it's such an honor to get to come as a foreigner and be a part of what these giants have built. And it's the people who've been working at the Sierra de Atapuerca and all of that series of sites for many, many decades.
Right, right. And I think this might be a good time just to kind of go into what Atapuerca is and maybe just, a brief description and why it's so important and maybe what we're looking at in the future there.
Yeah, this is an amazing place. So for a really long time, hundreds of years, people have known that there are these caves in these mountains that are just outside of the city of Burgos. Burgos is a small city, about 175,000 people, and it's right on this small river, the Arlanzon. There are these mountains, sort of small mountains, not giant mountains, small mountains, just to the east of the city. And there are these, and they're limestones. And so, like so many cave systems that are karstic like that, there's all these entrances and they change through time as things collapse and all that. But people have known that there has been archaeology and remains of past animals and human remains for a long time. The first story I had heard about Atapuerca was that it came to the attention of the scientific community, sort of the biological community and paleontologists, because teenage boys would go climbing through the caves and get cave bear teeth to impress their girlfriends.
Oh.
And so local teachers, became aware of what was going on. I think that's just folklore. I think actually people, scientists and people who were in the academic world knew about it longer than that. But it became really well known in more contemporary times with the work of I keep thinking of these three men who have worked together in incredible synergy for their whole careers. So you have Jose Maria Bermudez de Castro, who's very well known for his incredible research on the dentition, which is what I work on. So in a sense, he's an inspiration to me, and it's wonderful to be here where he was a trailblazer. And then you have Juan Luis Arzuaga, and he is very well known for leading the research to this cave system that has um, these specimens that look like they were in people bodies that were um, dropped down into a cave system where there were also cave bears. And then you find this one beautiful stone tool that looks kind of like an Acheulean hand axe. Forgive me, I'm not an archaeologist, so I know I'm
Oh, it
calling it by
looks
all
like
the
one of
wrong
these,
technology. Yeah. And
but
it
it
is
looks
the
much
logo of the
prettier.
center. And yeah, it's like this beautiful this red stone is really, really spectacular. And then Eudad Carbonell, who's oh gosh, he's well known for working at a gazillion sites across Spain, and kind of more on the archaeology side. So the three of them were graduate students together, and then have managed to work together. Um, because so many people in paleoanthropology have these huge egos, and projects kind of fall apart, and it's
Mhm,
hard to
absolutely.
anyway. But to find these people who are all really different, all three of them are really different personalities, but they manage to work in sync, in synergy with each other and side by side, because they've run three separate projects, because at Atapuerca there are a number of different caves and then some other sites kind of nearby. And they've managed to run these projects in synergy, but also somewhat independently, and at the same time really build up paleoanthropology here in Spain, to the point where they were able to draw in enough interest to build this research center that's here in Burgos. And it's supported by the government of Castilla y Leon, but also was funded through funds through the European Union. And a lot of the research money comes from the Spanish national government. And but really, just the enthusiasm for the science is because of their ability to really work together and to not battle each other. So, coming from outside of Spain and from the United States, where there's just always this really strong and, you know, independence and sort of cowboy approach, it's
Right.
wonderful to see this different version of how to do the science for the greater good.
And that sounds amazing, the fact that you're talking about the synergy that's going on. I mean, it truly sounds fantastic. I know one of my mentors, one of the first things she told me, half jokingly, but also uh, seriously, was at least in the United States, in paleoanthropology, your colleagues don't stab you in the back; they stab you in the front. Um, so it's definitely a very, like you said, there's definitely egos in the field, And to hear about this research center where it's truly just about getting the work done and getting the word out and getting the science done, that's really great to hear. And maybe one day in the future, if you're willing, I'll have you on my podcast because it sounds like we could dedicate a whole hour just to Atapuerca and talking about what's going on there. But
Yeah, and you might want to try to reach out to the directora, or the director of the center, Maria Martin Torres. She's been here about a year longer than I have. She was here earlier, and then she was in London for a while, and then came back to be the director of the center. And she is one of the most amazing people I've ever met. Her skills at one, she's a fantastic scientist. She's an amazing morphologist and anatomist of the dentition. So I've long admired her research.
mhm,
But then to watch her be the director of the center and just the vision that she has, and then being able to make something happen. I mean, there's an amazing scientists all over, you can find a lot of amazing
right.
scientists, but to find scientists who can actually direct and lead
Hmm.
groups of people and be really good at to be a director, you've got to be really good at interacting with people from all walks of life and like with the government and the mayor and funding sources. And it's just been such a wonderful experience to be here for almost 3 years now
Yeah.
and really watch that happening too. It's inspirational. And to be perfectly honest, it means a lot to me to be somewhere where there's a woman who's
Mm,
leading and leading just so effectively as well. It's
absolutely.
been,
Yes.
I come at when I was at Berkeley, the department I was in when I was hired into it was only about 20% women. So
Mm,
it's wonderful to have this shift in
yes.
the gender
Yes.
dynamics.
I'm
So
sure. And that, totally random off topic, but I am very happy and proud that when I view my analytics or my viewership and everything, it is like almost 50-50 male female. Like I'm very
nice.
happy that I'm attracting
You're
everybody.
sampling
Yes.
evenly.
Um so so that's amazing work that's going on at Atapuerca and everything and what you're doing. And well, we haven't talked about what you're doing yet, actually. So what are
Yeah, because
you doing?
I don't, my name is on the Atapuerca grant and I have a very small role. Yeah, that's not my project.
Right. So, what is your current project? How's that going? What started it? Kind of tell us about that.
Yeah, so I have long been interested in the genetic mechanisms that influence anatomical variation, skeletal and dental variation, so that then when we're looking at the fossil record, we have a better sense of what that variation that we're studying represents in terms of genetic influences or non-genetic influences. Because when we think about evolution and Darwin, in order for selection to be operating on something, it has to be that variation has to be the result of genetic influences. So my research has been to identify to differentiate the skeletal and dental variation that's the result of genetic forces versus non-genetic. And there's times you would want the other way around, but I've been really
Absolutely. Yeah.
focused on this. So I've done that work for many years, and I focus on the dentition because once teeth erupt, they don't change shape. They do wear down and they break, but you can tell what that is. So, in a sense, you have a lot less of these non-genetic factors that are shaping the variation in the dentition compared to the rest of the skeleton. And over the years, as I was doing that work, I would pick up instances where we would see that the genetic influences on the dentition were having these effects also on other parts of the anatomy.
Hmm.
So on body size or on height, on some other factors as well that we could talk a little bit about perhaps later. But I kept putting them aside because I was really focused on just trying to identify ways to characterize dental variation that was better reflecting the way genes make the dentition, the way they develop and all of that. So I was very focused on that. Around the time that I came to Spain, um, I had kind of gotten to the point where I had done a lot of that work and was kind of thinking about turning my attention more towards the genetic factors that influence dental variation, but also have these ties to other parts of the anatomy. So when you have these shared genetic effects, so like an allele, a gene that influences one part of the anatomy here and another part here, we call that pleiotropy. So these shared genetic effects.
Mhm.
So I started thinking I'd really like to spend more of an effort thinking about these pleiotropic effects. So it turns out I came in May of we decided 2021. We worked the years back, and at the same, I guess about 3 or 4 days after I showed up in Spain, we were running around trying to get all of my paperwork and my residence permit, and
Mhm.
signed up for all of the things I needed to be here. I would have this downtime to sit in my beautiful empty office. And since I didn't really have any of my books, I didn't have a research team here or anything, I actually was able to just sit at a table, look out the window at the cathedral with the Sierra de Atapuerca, on the other look, I could see that through the other window, and just think, what do I want to do?
Mm.
So a few days into my stay here, the European Union announced the call for these European Research Council grants. And the granting system in Europe is really different than in the United States. There's somewhat a similarity, but in other ways it's structured very differently. And they have these grants that are for senior researchers, and they are awarded to an individual, but it's to do a project that is considered intellectually higher risk. So kind of an outside the box idea.
Mhm.
Um,
Okay.
so you got to have the idea, but you also have to be a senior scientist as well.
So they have to
So I
have
sat.
some kinda trust in you before just
Yeah, so you've
yeah.
demonstrated that, if you give me a big sum of money, I will do something with it. So I'm at that point in my career where I'm more senior, and so I qualified for that, and it's 2.5 million euros, which in our world is a lot of money in our
Yeah,
research world.
yeah.
So I just sat at this table with these beautiful views, and I thought, what's my dream project if I had 2.5 million
That is
euros?
amazing. Yeah.
And yeah, so I wrote up that proposal focusing on those pleiotropic effects, that shared genetic effects between dentition and other aspects of anatomical variation. And it got funded. So I was able to
Nice.
build my team out quite quickly after I got here. So now I have uh, th- four postdocs and a PhD student and a project manager, and we'll be hiring for another researcher soon to join the team. And all of this work is looking using we have three different aims. That one of them is doing more work in quantitative genetics using a baboon model, which I've been doing for a while, but it's building that out by not focusing just on the dentition, but dentition and other aspects of the skeleton. Another aim within the grant is looking at modern humans and dental variation in modern humans. And then the third component is taking what we're learning from the first two and applying it into deeper time with the fossil record, primarily out of Eastern Africa, but also here in the Iberian Peninsula.
Okay. Wow. So when we're talking about dentition and you're in Spain, who's dentition? You mentioned modern humans and you mentioned we are working on baboons, but who's is there other dentition you're looking at? Are you looking at Neanderthal dentition? Are you looking at
Yeah, so I the that the my interest in the modern human dental variation stems from a project that so my research up until about 5, 6 years ago was using a baboon model for the modern genetics, and then with the aim of being able to apply that then to fossils. So my fossil research has been in hominids, but also in fossil circumpithecoids, so fossil monkeys as well. So then I had, when I was at Berkeley, I taught a course in human biological variation
mhm,
for the whole time I was there. So about 20 years of
yeah,
this teaching over my teaching career, of this class that I really enjoyed because it gave me the opportunity to look at and really study modern human biological variation. And so, even though my research area was in this particular area of genetics, and then also in paleontology, I had this broad knowledge that I had built up over the decades of teaching human biology course, and had gotten really interested in how people have migrated into different parts of the world.
Okay.
I'm going to answer your question. I'm just answering it in a very long way, I promise.
Trust me, I with working with paleoanthropologists, I know the game. I'm used to
Okay.
it.
I'm going to start answering your question by being way over here. So in doing all this work in genetics, and I have a really obviously had built a really strong understanding of genetic influences on the dentition, and we know that some of these alleles of a wide range of genes, these different variants of these genes, can lead to variation in dentition that you see across human populations. So there's this whole discipline called dental anthropology, which is this study of small variants in shape of teeth across human populations. And so if you go back into like the 1970s, 1980s, dental anthropologists were using this minor variation because it differed across populations, basically as a proxy for genetic variation. So it's a way to look at population affinity, so relationships
Mhm.
between different populations, reconstruct population migration patterns and relationships. Now, I was very aware of those patterns. I was very aware of what we know about the genetics, but I hadn't actually done that research. But I had started talking to a colleague named Richard Scott. So, G. Richard Scott. And he is one of these very senior researchers in dental anthropology. So he knew I was interested in applying some of my genetics thinking to modern human dentitions because we'd been talking about maybe ways to collaborate. So
Mhm.
he had organized this symposium at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is actually going on right now in Denver, but this was
Right, right.
years ago. And it was on how people migrated into the Western Hemisphere. And he was supposed to give a talk about what we know about this from dental variation and dental anthropology. Turns out he was going to be in New Zealand and Australia at the time and didn't want to fly all the way back
Yeah.
to the United States. I think it was in Boston or Baltimore that year. So he asked if I would give the talk, knowing that even though it's not my research area, I'd been thinking a lot about it. And because he asked me to do this, it kind of forced me to sit down and put a bunch of pieces of this puzzle together that I had jumping around in my brain because of the class, but I had never actually sat down and made myself kind of sketch out what I was thinking.
Mhm.
But I did it for this talk. And while I was doing that, I realized that out of evolutionary genomics, we'd been finding evidence of really intense selection on different variants of genes. And a lot of these are things we expected because they were related to malaria or skin pigmentation variation, things like that. But there's this one allele of this gene called EDAR, or the ectodysplasin A receptor, this one variant that was the result of really intense selection, up there with like loss of fever and, malaria, really intense selection. But we had no idea what in the world was the phenotype. Like, why was it selected for? What effect does it have on the body that could have been selected on like that? Turns out, if you go over into genetics in the dentition, we actually had recently figured out, we and not me, but researchers in China and Japan, in that area of the world, had found that this allele, where this allele is much more common, influences some shape variation in modern human teeth.
Mhm.
But the shape variant, it's called incisor shoveling, is
Mhm. Mhm.
at basically 100% frequency in the indigenous populations in the Americas.
Right.
So then also knowing that you have really intense selection based on latitude because of ultraviolet radiation exposure, because all of the research done on skin pigmentation variation, has demonstrated that's been multiple times that we've had strong selection for depigmentation and higher degrees of pigmentation in that. So then I knew that the higher latitude you go, so if you go up into the Arctic, there's no way to depigment enough to get enough ultraviolet radiation to have a healthy level of vitamin D for your body to biosynthesize vitamin D. So there's like this line that so Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin have led the research on this.
Mm.
There's this latitudinal line where humans can't biologically adapt anymore to live up there. So you have to culturally innovate. So it's like this barrier. And you don't see people up in that region of the world until about 35,000 years ago when you have these cultural innovations that happened. So I put all of these pieces together. I was like, this episode of selection, we know when it happened. And if you think about where people were at 25,000 years ago when that bout of selection happened, there was a population living up in the Arctic. And then you've got the last ice age. They would have been under a period of isolation. We see this in the mitochondrial DNA. We see this in other DNA now, but at the time it was just Tamidal had found that you have an episode of intense isolation of this population based on the mitochondrial DNA. So I put all of these pieces together and made the case that you had intense selection on this variant of this gene because of the way it was influencing physiological variation. So we can see it because of the shape variation in the dentition, but because of pleiotropy, it's having an effect on the dentition. But the other thing it's affecting is all of your other these other traits, and one of them is mammary glands. And so the
Hmm.
ductal branching in mammary glands increases. You have more ductal branching with this variant than you do without the variant. And so we hypothesized that in this really far north, this Arctic population, that if this increased ductal branching in the mammary glands facilitated nutrient transfer to any degree that might improve vitamin D transfer, or there's a number of other nutrients that might be, but maybe vitamin D would be the most sensitive given that high latitude. But even if the advantage is very, very small, because that population was in isolation, it would be under really intense positive selection. And so the teeth were the window into locating where in time and where in geography that selection happened. But the teeth were not what was being selected on. They're just along for
Right.
the ride because of pleiotropy. So that got me really interested in looking at what other dental variants um, this EDAR is part of this ectodysplasin pathway. So what other variants can we see in the dentition that are reflecting variation in this pathway? So upregulation or downregulation in this pathway, and could that tell us anything else about other episodes of selection? So it's really interesting then to look at the dentition of people here in Europe. See,
Mhm.
I came back to teeth and Europe. So we get back to Europe because when you think about Neanderthals,
Right.
um, we know that they were under selection for traits that are linked to colder weather,
Mhm.
more northern climates. What about their teeth? So can some of the variation that we see in their dentitions, is that a reflection of selection on the ectodysplasin pathway? And might that actually be telling us something about um, milk biology, mammary
Right, right.
glands, or other aspects of this pathway? So that's what we're building. So in this aim, the second aim of this ERC grant, the European Research Council grant. Um, we are building out a database of these data that were collected over the 70s and the 80s and the 90s of minor variation across all of these human populations, with the aim of being able to see patterns that might be reflective of perturbations in the ectodysplasin pathway. And so then does that you see that happening in certain populations as they um, that are more pastoral, for example, or hunter-gatherer, or as they shift into agriculture, or that maybe perhaps varies by latitude, as we might hypothesize based on what we were finding with the EDAR variant. So we're still in the very early stages of that. We're just building the database right now. So we haven't really started testing any of those
Right,
hypotheses.
right.
But we know that Neanderthals they'd have something that looks like incisor shoveling, but it
Mhm.
looks different from the ones that you see in modern humans, which possibly throws out the hypothesis that maybe they have the same kind of selection on their mammary glands that you see in modern humans in the Arctic.
Right,
Um,
right,
but it was a different mutation because the anatomy is a little bit different.
right. Absolutely. Which all of that is stunningly fascinating, by the way. And I hope everyone followed along because that was you made it very easy to understand. You did
Well,
that was
hopefully
a
it's
great job.
it's a lot of pieces to pull together.
It
So
was. It was, and it truly, I mean, that was I really enjoyed that. That was a lot of information that I truly learned from, and it has brought me a lot of questions and even my own ideas. And so, like, so I would assume then in your research, if you're assuming that the shoveling has a relation to the branching, you would think that Neanderthals in different parts of the world, say in the Levant versus in Spain, you would see different branching.
or the ones in the Levant may not have faced that. I mean, perhaps it's only as you go into northern climates that that
Right,
populations are going to experience that. If even, I mean, if you don't have the variation, then you can't have selection operating on it. So, this is all very new to be
right,
thinking about teeth as a window into the infancy basically, and
right, right.
that mother infant relationship. It's, we're in very early days of this research area. So we'll see what plays out. I mean, there's always the possibility that when we first start seeing patterns like this and throwing out these hypotheses and you start doing the studies to test them, it's possible that we're completely wrong.
Right, of
You know?
course.
Um, but it's also possible that we're partly right, and it might actually be somewhat a little bit different. Maybe it's not vitamin D, maybe it's not mammary glands, maybe it's
Right.
something else. I've been working with a colleague at the University of Arizona at the medical school, Larry Mandarino, and he runs a research center into type 2 diabetes.
Mm,
And populations in in the United States and into the the American Southwest and you know we think a lot about how these Native American populations have a really high risk of
mhm,
type 2 diabetes. Well, one of the other things that they have is a really high proportion of this variant of the EDAR gene, because they have there's about there's a lot of mixture between indigenous populations and the colonial populations,
mhm.
and then also you've got slave population,
Right,
African
right.
populations that were brought in through slavery and lots of that. So anyway, you've got in these populations that are really high risk for type 2 diabetes, turns out that you have this variant, this allele at like zero point 0.5 frequency. So about 50% of them have it. So when I first started talking with Larry about our research in our hypothesis about this relationship to mammary glands, his research group was able to look at mammograms that had been done on women in these study groups that they work on for type 2 diabetes, and we found that there is an association between the density that you see in a mammogram, which is not the same thing as ductal branching, but
Mhm,
we were thinking it might be a proxy. You do see this association, but perhaps even more interesting is that you see an association between um, these uh, levels of these different physiological features that are associated with type 2 diabetes and the degree of those levels alongside having one or two copies of this variant, which suggests that actually the active dysplasин pathway may play a role in type 2 diabetes as well.
mm, mhm,
So, and this is a paper that was published a few years back, maybe about 2.5 years ago. Really interesting, kind of an out there idea because people hadn't been putting those pieces together, and so he is a wonderful colleague because every few months or every 6 months we'll bat back and forth references of new papers that have come out, like, hey, look at this, and hey, look at this.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's wonderful, as I think he's going to be pursuing, his hope is to pursue some of those questions in the future, and is pulling together ideas for that and grant proposals and things. But um, everything's still in the background and not in the
right,
publication
right,
side
right.
just yet.
So a question popped into my mind that I've actually never wondered before. So in populations that have shoveling in adult dentition, is
Yeah,
there any difference in deciduous teeth?
that's a really good question. Yeah, that's a super good question. I actually do not know the answer to that. I'll have to go look that up. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never thought about it before until now, but I wonder
Yeah.
if there's any difference.
Yeah. Do baby incisors have shoveling? I know there's going to be a dental anthropologist out there going, "Oh, I can't believe you don't know the answer to that. It's so obvious." But I do want to just point out I'm not really a dental anthropologist. I like to play one on TV. So
But yeah, that I'll have yeah, we'll have to look into that. That's really interesting. Um, okay, so why don't we transition a little bit and why don't we talk about the upcoming conference in March? Why don't we make this a little kind of an advertisement and then we'll talk a
I
little
would
bit about it.
I would
So,
love to. Yeah.
yeah. So, first of all, what is the AABA? Because a lot of my listeners are definitely more enthusiasts and not, involved as much themselves. So, I think defining what it is and why we go to these events might be a great uh,
Yeah,
first
so
step.
the American Association of Biological Anthropologists. So this is an organization that was, oh my gosh, I should know what year we were established. Um, so we've been holding these annual. I think they were established, but then we've been holding these annual meetings for. I'm going to tell you. I think
I think it's
is this our
94 years.
actually this is our 93rd annual
Oh,
meeting.
93rd. Okay.
But to be perfectly honest, it's actually the 92nd time that we've gotten together because we had to cancel in 2020 because of the pandemic. So, and there was an idea of actually not calling it the, frame shifting, so that we're like,
Yeah.
okay, this is the 91st meeting. And I'm like, wait, that's too confusing. So yeah, so it's our 93rd annual meeting, but one of them we ended up canceling, but there was a little bit of an online presence.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so this is a way for everyone who has a an academic interest, who is a professional or training to be a professional in biological anthropology, to get together once a year and present research, present new ideas, network, and spend a few days together reconnecting with colleagues that you perhaps talk to only on email or Zoom calls. Just a really wonderful way to build community for biological anthropologists. So it's called the American Association. It is very North American centric, although we make an effort to reach out and to have an international presence. It is very much dominated by people in North America.
Mhm.
And you'll see there's other biological anthropology associations elsewhere in the world, but we are the largest one. And biological anthropology is, um, in many ways, a very American discipline,
Mhm.
because if you like, coming to Europe has been very interesting because you've got paleoanthropology, you have archaeology. You don't really have a biological anthropology, because bioanthropology comes out of this very American version of anthropology where you have these four fields that come together. And so then you have a human biology nested within anthropology that just doesn't exist in other academic structures. So while we have these associations that focus on paleoanthropology, for example, here in Europe or elsewhere in the world, they're just not as interdisciplinary as what you see in biological anthropology in the United States. So AABA is a fairly large association as a consequence, because it encompasses a lot more disciplines and touches into a lot more disciplines and is more interdisciplinary than what you'll see elsewhere in the world. So it's from my perspective, it's a place to go to reconnect with colleagues and at the same time to learn new things. I actually really
Mhm.
enjoy going and sitting through symposia and sessions that are outside my discipline as a way to get introduced to the latest research in an area that I don't follow the literature, for example.
Right, right. And last year was my first attendance, and
Oh, wonderful.
I had such a good time. I was so lucky that Dr. Brianna Pobiner took me under her wing. She
Ah,
literally led me through the whole thing. She took me to the president's dinner even. I mean, it was very special. It was
ah,
a great first experience, and just financially, I don't know if I'll be able to make it to ones across the country, but lately last year it was in Reno and this year it's in LA, so it just kind of worked out for me.
oh,
So I'm
good.
definitely going this year and I'm very excited. And so basically, during these, I think it's not a full week, is it? It's
No, so it for some people it becomes a full week because there are these cognate associations that are smaller, more specialized groups
right.
that will hold meetings just at the beginning, or they'll have their business meetings during the AABA conference, but they don't hold a separate. So, for example, there's the Dental Anthropology Association and the um, 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 American Anthropological Associate Ameri oh, A Triple AG, forgive me for forgetting the name off the top of my head. And they will hold their business meetings and do sessions, but they don't run a separate meeting. But then the Human Biology Association and Paleopathology Society and the Paleoanthropology
Mhm.
Association are holding, sessions. Their meeting is actually just before AABA begins, and
Yes.
so they operate kind of under the wing of AABA because we're a larger association. We've arranged the hotel and all of that. But then, and actually, paleoanthropology only meets with us every other year, and they're also with the
Right,
Society of
right.
American Archaeologists on the off year.
So I'm very looking forward to the Paleoanthropology Society this year because I missed it last year. Um, And so, during these few days, the things that happen, you mentioned your symposia, there's workshops, there's people there's a lot of just connecting. There's a lot of it's just so besides the fact that that was my first meeting with the AABA last year, that was my first conference in general.
Oh, was
And
it?
yeah, it was. So it was a very eye-opening experience, but I was very nervous. I was very one, just because of my academic standing, which right now is like 0. I'm a science communicator. I don't really have an academic standing yet. I'm on my first research project right now, and I am so excited. Um,
Wonderful.
but so going this year, like I'm gonna feel much more, like I'm kind of where I should be. But I met so many of the people that I've had on my show, which was wonderful.
Wow.
Getting to see them in person and getting to shake their hands and just have it. If you can go to these events and you're interested and you're a member, I can't recommend it more. I mean, getting to actually meet your fellow anthropologists in person, like you said, these are people you typically only email with or you Zoom with, or you have, if you're lucky, you go out in the field with them once a year or something. Um,
Yeah.
so these meetings are very critical in the networking of anthropology. And that's what the world of paleoanthropology is about, is connecting those little lights to make the big bright chain. And so the ABA is, you know, why I go. And that's why last year I thought about kind of live streaming some parts of it, but I was like, no, it's my first time. I want to just enjoy it.
Yeah.
This year I might like live tweet or do something about something. We'll see. So if you guys are interested in that, stay tuned. That's March 20 something, right? The week of March 20.
Yeah, yeah. So I show up on the 7th. I leave Spain on the 17th, and the meeting starts on that Wednesday, which is set the 20th through the
Yeah,
23rd.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, March 20th through 23rd. And if people want some information about this, the website is bioanth.org. So BIOANTH.org. Go check it out.
And I will put that in the description so you
Great,
guys can
thanks.
visit that. And so, so what's next for you? You know, you're mentioning you're working on that. You just got this 2 million euro grant. Is
Yeah.
that what's the next few years for you, or do you have other ideas as well, or are you kind of
Yeah.
set?
So this is a 5-year grant, and we just recently finished our first year. So I have 4 more years of leading this, and yeah, it keeps me pretty busy. And being
Mhm.
president keeps me pretty busy. I had a little bit out of touch with the presidency because I've been a bit sick over the last 10 months. And so I actually had to step out of my role. And the wonderful and amazing Steve Lee, who's the past president, was so gracious about stepping back in. I mean, he didn't have a lot of choice because it's in the bylaws that he had to step in, but he was so gracious and so kind about it. So yeah, I'm really, as of the last week or two, started to pick back up all of the balls that you
Mhm.
carry as president, which is why some of the facts are not at the tip of my tongue. Um, yeah, so I think between the presidency and the project, the ERC project, which is called Tied to Teeth. So if
Right.
people want to follow us, we are on Instagram and on Twitter or X. It's at Tied and then the number two and then teeth, tied to teeth. So you can follow along and see what we're up to. And right now we're really emphasizing trying to bring more light to the research that happens. It's kind of invisible.
Mhm.
So, when you're figuring out data collection protocols, when you're figuring out how to clean up data sets, when you're figuring out how to buy which scanner you want to buy and scanning the
Yeah.
thousand baboon dentitions, that type of work, which um, people don't see. You only see the
Yeah. Yeah.
publications on the outside, but you spend years doing that background work. So one of the things I've been enjoying about social media is that we can bring some more attention to that part of the research, even though it's hard, usually normally hard to see.
Yeah.
So yeah, so those are the things that keep me really busy right now and probably will for the next couple of years.
And I think, I mean, you can let me know if I'm wrong, but I think COVID definitely played a big role in allowing scientists to show off that aspect of their work, the behind the scenes, because all the researchers were at home or at their labs, or they weren't out in the field, so they were doing their backlogs of data and they were building their collections. And I think science communication really benefited from COVID. Like, unfortunately, COVID obviously, like, let's not say anything good about it, but I think science communication kind of exploded because of it, because so many people, they were bored. They wanted to show off their work and what they were doing. And I know I started World of Paleoanthropology, I think, in 2019, so literally a year before COVID. So I started this whole Zoom thing, and then Zoom took off, and I was like, okay, well, let's take advantage of this.
Yeah.
But even now, you're in Spain and we're having this talk, and I think I'm again so grateful that you have come on the show. It means a lot to me that I'm able to get guests such as yourself to come and share their experiences. I guess I have one last question.
Yeah.
And well, two. I have two because there's one that I've been forgetting to ask my last few guests, and it's the hardest question I can ask, and that is, what is your favorite hominin?
My favorite hominin?
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah,
Oh. My
yeah, exactly.
yeah. Well, I guess it depends. You know what I mean? My favorite, like if I were out in the field and I could find it,
Like
or if I
non-human.
had to go back in time and be
Oh,
that species.
um, just like your favorite to study, I guess. Like if you had to pick one hominin that you had to study the rest of your life, their remains, their archaeology, if their culture, or anything, what would your pick be? The rest, you can't
Um,
study them. They're gone. They don't exist.
well, it's interesting because, it's funny you ask because at the beginning of my career, I thought humans were really, really boring because they're just like us. And I really only liked Miocene things and late Miocene, and that was my aim. But you always have to be careful about being really strongly opinionated
Mhm.
because as soon as you're like, I would never work on that, 20 years later, you're like, actually, I think humans are my favorite. And
Yeah.
I'm really fascinated right now. I'm really fascinated by humans prior to agriculture and
Okay.
just the way that we the way that we managed to move into all these different
Mhm.
environments, and we did it biologically, and we
Right.
did it culturally, and we did it with a combination of those. And that's so freaking cool to think
It is.
about that
It is.
interplay between biology and complex culture at that level of complex culture. And so if I had to be limited, I'd go there.
And I think that's something we're just now beginning to put together and realize that you have to combine the culture and the biology to understand what it means to be human. Because
Yeah.
before it was one or the other. And if you dared suggest, one thing out of the box, you were shunned. And then my last question is, you were a professor for a long time. You've had goodness knows how many students. I'm sure you've given this advice plenty of times. But for my listeners who are interested in either becoming archaeologists or paleoanthropologists, or their dream is to work in Atapuerca, what is your advice to them? What can you tell them?
Oh, my biggest piece of advice is just to be bold and to not be afraid to ask, because piece of advice that I got when I was at your stage of life was squeaky wheel gets the grease. And at the
Mm,
time, I was like, well, I don't like being rude. I don't want to, I don't want to ask for too much and all that. But it's really good advice. The squeaky wheel does get the grease, and you want to, be polite, but you got to ask, right? And you're never
yeah,
going to get something you don't ask for. And that's especially these days, because I think academia has changed so much, and the science and the way science is done has changed so much over the last 20, 25 years that the path I took would be impossible now.
right.
So I think people really have to innovate their own
Hmm.
path because there's not a set path to follow. Um, and that means then you really do have to be bold
Right.
and kind of trailblaze, even if you want to do something, in a sense, follow a traditional career of just being going into being a professor, for example. Even that's not there's no traditional path to follow to get there anymore. And
Right.
I'm not even sure people want that job anymore. I think there's so many variants on it that might be better
Hmm.
depending on what someone's interests are and the things that really catch their passion more than some others. There's a lot more variation and a lot more perturbations of the jobs, and which then means there's a lot more variation in which path to follow. So every path is a trailblaze. So be bold and
Yes.
don't be afraid to be a squeaky wheel.
Yes, I think that is amazing advice. And that is the exact advice that my partner gave me on starting the world of paleoanthropology. So I'm like, I want to talk to, these people, but they're so prestigious. They're not human, they're gods in the field, they're whatever. And so
Oh.
they're like, just email someone. And, we're having issues at the moment. He doesn't talk to me anymore, Dr. Berger doesn't
Mm.
talk to me anymore because I agreed with the criticism against Miletti. But my first person, I emailed him first, and I'm just like, "Hey, I've never done this before. Would you be interested in having a YouTube chat?" And he's like, "Sure, let's do it live." I'm like, "Oh, uh,
Okay.
okay." So we did it, and it was amazing, and that's what started this whole thing. So despite whatever's going on with him, I do have to thank him for you know, getting me started. But it is that boldness. It is that what my partner said. What's the worst that's going to happen? They're going to say no. You know.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
And yeah, I early on, I was trying to get my foot in the door, and had no idea how to do any of this. And there was a guy, well, his name still is Noel Boaz, and he's not particularly well known in the field. He's not really active anymore. And some of the work he did misidentified some fossils that, and, kind a little embarrassing, in hindsight, if it
Mhm.
was, you'd be like, oops. um, but he was teaching at a college, at a satellite campus of, of a college nearby where I was living. And I had written him and I just said, send him an email and said, would, do you have a lab? Could I volunteer? I just want to learn anything.
Mhm.
And he was like, "Yeah, come on over. You can come over on Fridays." And he made up stuff for me to do. Like,
Yeah.
I entered data into a data set. But then I tagged along to the classes that he taught, and he had some guest speakers, and I got to meet them. And, he was just really nice to open the door for
Mhm.
me. And that was exactly what I needed. I needed a foot in the door and someone to give me the opportunity to meet people and do things. And so, even if that first person in the relationship is not, I'm sorry that it soured a little for you,
Yeah, yeah.
but you can always still be really those people, what they've done for us, really we
Mhm.
can be really grateful for, and it can be, life changing.
It
So
abs Yes, exactly, exactly.
yeah.
And with that, I think is a perfect place for us to make a conclusion of this chat. I have had a wonderful time talking to you. I have learned so much, and I am even more excited for the conference this year. And for anyone listening, I'm literally looking at emails that are coming in right now about when I'm meeting you at the AABAs. So I will see you guys there and then. Gonna be great. And thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it so much, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your evening as it looks like it is getting dark there.
It is getting dark. Yeah. Well, it's really nice to meet you. I look forward to seeing you in Los Angeles. Thank
Yes,
you.
absolutely. All right, everyone. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe and like, and we'll see you next time. Bye.